Now that we have this more likely murder weapon identified, we can profitably reinterpret some of the other events which were caught on video that day. Fact: flames rise. Sparks fall. Since a video taken of the southeast corner of Building 7 shows combustion behavior exhibiting a fall, this combustion more closely resembles a thermitic reaction than a typical fire. This resemblance is a sign that in addition to fires present in Building 7, there was at least this thermitic reaction also taking place inside the building prior to its collapse. Fact: the roofline of Building 7 descended at an acceleration which is indistinguishable from free fall during this interval of descent of over 8 stories. Since free fall acceleration requires zero resistive forces, this is a sign that there were no resistive forces during at least this interval of descent. Since the official narrative's fire-induced progressive collapse cannot account for such an interval of free fall, it cannot claim this fact. Since demolition may cause an interval of free fall, it can claim this fact. Fact: Building 7 also appears to have collapsed symmetrically. Since such a neat symmetrical collapse requires simultaneous core column failure, it is impossible from a fire-induced progressive collapse. Since symmetrical collapse is the goal of controlled demolition, however, this characteristic is also a sign of controlled demolition. Fact: before the Twin Towers fell, some early streamers can be seen falling to the ground. Notice the trail. Since a white, immediately concentrated, winding corkscrew wake cannot have been carried from the black smoke at the top, it must be something else. Since its sporadic appearance corresponds with an increase in its descent speed as it falls, this is a sign that it is energetic. Since this sporadically igniting piece of debris was inside the building before it came down, this is a sign that incendiaries were inside this building before it came down. Fact: measuring the descent of this roofline until it is obscured from view shows a uniform acceleration. Since a momentary deceleration is not observed during this interval, this is a sign, as per Isaac Newton's third law of motion, that there was no impact when there should have been an impact, implying that the descent of this upper portion was not the cause of the demolition of the supporting structure below it, but was the result of the demolition of the supporting structure below it. Fact: this projectile is obviously being accelerated by a force greater than gravity alone. As it descends, in addition to its increasing speed, at this moment it also acquires an increase in acceleration. This requires energy. Since in this moment this projectile appears to have no available energy source other than its wake, then by elimination this is a sign that its wake is the source of its energy, implying that the white smoke may be a burning accelerant which was painted or sprayed on to this projectile. Since nanothermite is stable when wet, this scenario is entirely possible. Fact: after this projectile is ejected from the debris cloud, it changes direction. It can be verified in other videos that this change in direction is not just a perspective effect, but that in a moment it actually loses one component of momentum and gains another. That is a sign of impulse. Since mid-air impulse cannot come from gravity alone, it has no warrant in the official explanation, but should be expected by a late-firing explosive reaction. Fact: this projectile's white smoke trail does not point back to the debris cloud that the projectile came from, and therefore it requires a source other than this debris cloud. Notice also that this smoke trail follows the projectile through all its twists and turns all the way down to the ground. Since this immediately concentrated corkscrew wake cannot have come from the primary debris cloud, it has no warrant in the official explanation, but should be expected by the continuing combustion of whatever accelerant is painted onto this projectile. Fact: look closely. This piece can be seen flaring in one moment, then splitting. One of its ejections can also be seen splitting, and one of its ejections splits again. These explosions may seem small, but the fact that there are explosions at all confirms the presence of explosives in the building before its collapse. Fact: many ejections, often called squibs, are observed several stories below the falling debris. It is very frequently claimed that they are puffs of air which would have been pressurized by the falling upper section. Since air pressure escapes through the paths of least resistance, and since the resistance presented by a window is far less than the resistance presented by a steel corner column, air pressure would never naturally elect to decompress through a steel corner column in the presence of windows. Since at least one is observed at the point of a steel corner column, at least this one is, therefore, not pressurized air, and therefore something else must have caused it. Despite the dust, Locating the tip of this beam within a gleam of sunlight allows us to reference it in other videos, and thus measure its descent, which also shows a sudden onset of freefall acceleration. This fact of sudden freefall may also be seen as a sign that there was suddenly no resistance below this beam. Since we can see that this sudden onset of freefall corresponds with another ejection occurring at the corner column, we can assume causality. Further, since blown-out windows should be considered as points of least resistance, having allegedly been made such by the air pressure, it should not be expected that any additional air pressure caused by the pile-driving section would be bypassing these points of least resistance to build up pressure below them. Since some of these squibs are followed by others occurring even lower in the building before the pile driver reaches the point of the upper squibs, at least these squibs are also not due to the allegedly pressurized air from this upper pile-driving section of the building, and therefore something else must have caused them as well. If one is to maintain the theory that all these squibs are simply pressurized ejecting air, they have much more to explain. By contrast, since squibs are commonly observed in controlled demolitions, then by association, these also lend themselves as signs of a controlled demolition. Fact: steel beams are observed being ejected far from the pulverized concrete that they were reinforcing up until seconds before. Since natural breakage due to a collision, either mid-air or with the ground, does not replicate this behavior of pulverization, its consideration needs another warrant. It has been claimed that evidence of pulverization is actually evidence that explosives were not used, on the warrant that explosives occurring in quarries cause random breakage rather than pulverization. But since applying the results of explosions in solid rock to considerations about reconstituted rock would be the same error as applying the results of a blast in a raw potato to considerations about reconstituted mashed potatoes, this warrant is actually missing. Even though this claim has been made to serve as evidence by elimination rather than as a positive indicator, it is still not valid, and therefore it cannot profitably serve as either. And since such widespread pulverization is inconsistent with natural breakage, this is a sign that other forces must have been experienced during the collapses to cause all this pulverization. Fact: the arc of this stream seems to follow the path of an upward thrust more closely than a strictly horizontal thrust. Until we can imagine how a strictly downward pile driving should account for this upward component of ejection, this anomaly appears to be a sign that at least a part of this building literally exploded. Fact: according to Isaac Newton's third law of motion, if this lighter, more damaged structure had been exerting the forces needed to destroy this heavier, less damaged structure below, it should have been also experiencing those forces itself. Since of the two interacting portions of the building, this portion of the building was the smaller and therefore the lighter, and after the airplane impacts it was also the more damaged and was therefore the weaker, this portion would likely have been destroying itself during those equal and opposite crush-up forces. The hypothesis endorsed by NIST was advanced by these mathematicians. It states that the initial crush-up phase advanced into the upper portion of the building by only 37 millimeters for the North Tower before being, quote, arrested until reaching the ground where crush-up forces resumed. Since this seems to be effectively claiming that the interaction of forces was not equal and opposite, as required by Isaac Newton's third law of motion, it relies upon another apparent violation of Newtonian physics. Due to all the dust, it is difficult to determine with certainty what exactly is happening to this upper structure, but it may be instructive to note that in the locations you might intuitively expect to see it, it is noticeably absent. Further, immediately after the towers fell, the wind blew, exposing the core columns, momentarily swaying in the wind. The fact that they are still standing and even unbent after the supposed pile-driving forces from above is another sign that these pile-driving forces never occurred as described by Besant and friends and endorsed by NIST. Since this complete destruction required enough energy to complete it, and since explosives are a simpler explanation for that energy than the official narrative, then by Occam's razor, once again, demolition is the more valid hypothesis for this fact, and therefore best claims it. And further, since the principles of Newtonian physics don't change at this scale, overriding explanations such as huge, heavy, and massive, however principled they may seem, are simply non-scientific.
A huge weight, enormous force.
A tidal wave of destruction.
The entire top of the building came down pretty much in free fall because the kinetic energy that was unleashed was just huge.
Such a flagrancy of error coming from the supposedly scientific community may also be seen as an overarching sign of selection bias or elective ignorance, which we will discuss next as its high degree of consistency may relate to motive.